Chapter 6. The Weight of What Was. The cascade had left something behind. Not a memory, exactly. Not the kind she could bottle. It was more like the residue of one, a greasiness that clung to the back of her throat even now, 12 hours after she'd fled Holloway with her hair smelling of burnt sugar, and someone else's grief soaked into her coat. She'd scrubbed her hands 3 times. She could still feel the echo of it, that stranger's anguish, moving through her knuckles like a second pulse. Elira sat at her workbench in the dark, not having touched the lights. The lab existed in its familiar pre-dawn state, the long central table cluttered with specimen trays and crystallization chambers, each one emitting its own dim, quiet luminescence. Blues and soft ambers mostly, a few cold whites. They gave just enough light to see by, these sleeping memories, their gentle glow casting slow-moving shadows across the ceiling as the island drifted through its nightly rotation. Outside the porthole, the stratosphere was the deep bruised purple of something unhealed. She should sleep. She'd told herself that twice already while sitting here, still wearing her coat. Instead, she opened her archival terminal. The interface lit up her face in pale silver. She hadn't opened the folder labeled SV/neural map/trial 7 in 14 months. She knew because the system logged access timestamps, and every time she looked at that entry, she couldn't help scanning the last access date the way you probe a loose tooth. 14 months. Before that, 11. Before that, 3 weeks, because she'd been deep in a bad year. She opened it now. The files loaded slowly, as they always did, because the data was enormous. A full neural resonance map took up more storage than most archivists dealt with in a year. Sienna's had been extraordinary, even for a child, which was what Elira had told herself when she designed the experiment. Extraordinary. Scientific language, clean and without blame. She'd been so careful with her language back then. The playback window opened. The footage was grainy, captured on the lab's internal monitoring system rather than the precision rigs she used for proper documentation. She'd been more concerned with the readings that night than with archival quality. A mistake she cataloged among the other mistakes she didn't let herself list too often. The recording showed the lab from above. The overhead angle made everything look flat and small. Elira watched herself move, 5 years younger, carrying that particular briskness that came before bad things happened. Sienna was on the mapping chair at the center of the room, 7 years old, wearing the calibration headset Elira had built small enough to fit her. She was talking. Even with the footage's poor audio, Elira could read her lips on the parts she'd memorized.
Is it going to feel cold?
No, sweetheart. Like a small breeze.
Like a sneeze?
A small laugh.
Yes, just like a sneeze.
Elira pressed her thumbnail against her front teeth and watched. She'd reviewed this footage before. Countless times in the first year, until the Mnemosyne Council's grief counselor had told her it was becoming compulsive and she needed to stop. Then sporadically in the years after, late at night, for reasons she understood poorly and didn't examine. Each time she watched it, she was looking for the same thing, the moment of activation when her equipment had, in her long-settled accounting of the event, malfunctioned. Moment Sienna had flickered, but she'd never watched it with the forensic overlay active. She opened that tool now. It was a feature built for professional use, for tracing memory contamination and tracking access violations. She used it often in her work, analyzing crystals clients brought in that they suspected had been tampered with. She'd never once thought to apply it here to her own footage in her own files. Why not? She sat with that question while the overlay loaded, because she'd known what happened. She'd written the incident report herself. Equipment failure, experimental prototype, unintended fragmentation of a nascent resonance map. The council had accepted it. She had accepted it. She'd buried Sienna's remaining consciousness in its crystal case and sealed herself inside this lab and built the next 5 years around the shape of that accepted truth. The overlay finished loading. She played the footage from 12 minutes before the recorded moment of failure. The new layer of data bloomed across the screen in pale green threads, a web of timestamps and access logs laid over the visual feed like a second nervous system. She could see her own movements annotated. Each time she touched a control panel, the system logged her biometric signature as a small green node, clean and precise, labeled EVUSS and timestamped to the millisecond. She watched herself cross the room to check Sienna's headset calibration. Green node. She watched herself return to the main console. green node. She watched herself begin the preliminary resonance scan. Green node, green node. Then, 9 minutes before the failure, a different node appeared. It was positioned at the secondary access port on the far wall. She hadn't been standing there. She had been in the footage, crouching to check the output cables at the mapping chair's base. She could see herself clearly in the upper left corner of the frame. She was nowhere near the secondary port. But a node had activated there. She paused the playback, leaned forward until her nose was close to the screen and the silver light made her eyes ache. The node was labeled Knator. She read it 3 times. The letters didn't change. Knator. She knew that identifier. She'd known it for years before she ever sat in this lab, back when it was warm and familiar, associated with entirely different moments, with a different set of late nights and low light. Curran had used that identifier on every system they'd shared access to during the 7 years they'd spent working in adjacent research fields, before things went wrong between them in the slow, corrosive way that grief does to people who are already too similar. She played the footage forward. Knator's node appeared 3 more times in the following minutes, each one at the secondary port, each one activating a different function. She had to open a separate data window to decode what those functions were. Her hands were very still. She noticed that about herself, how completely still her hands were, resting flat on the workbench on either side of the keyboard. Something in her body had decided to brace. First access, initiating a parallel monitoring stream. He'd been watching in real time without her knowledge from somewhere else in the Lumen network. Second access, attempting to link to Sienna's headset calibration channel. Third access, a send command, directed at the headset. She sat back. The footage kept playing. In the top right corner of the frame, a younger Alira was still crouching by the cables, unaware. Sienna was visible in the mapping chair, small and still, the headset glowing faintly. And then the equipment had, by Alira's own report, malfunctioned. Except it hadn't malfunctioned. Something had been sent to Sienna's headset from an external source 9 minutes before the failure, and then Sienna had begun to flicker. The cold she felt then was not the ambient chill of the lab. It was the kind that comes from the inside out, from understanding something your body is slower to accept than your mind. She pressed one flat palm to her sternum and held it there, feeling her own heartbeat knock against her hand. He'd been in the system. Curran had been in her system that night, watching, reaching into her equipment with his access codes, while she worked 10 feet away and noticed nothing. And whatever he had sent down that calibration channel, whatever function that third command had triggered, something had happened to Sienna's resonance map in the moments that followed. The fragments she'd spent 5 years mourning as accidental damage, as her failure, as the consequence of a prototype that shouldn't have been used on a child no matter how brilliantly she'd built it. She needed to know what that send command had contained. She opened the raw log data for Knator's third access. The file was there, tucked inside her own archival system for 5 years, unread because she'd never looked at her own footage with forensic tools, because she'd already known what happened. The command payload was labeled Interrupt Sequence, Protective Isolation Protocol. She read the description field beneath it. Subroutine designed to sever an active resonance map from its extraction matrix mid-process, intended to preserve neural integrity during unexpected equipment failure or external threat. Effect: consciousness fragments distributed across local resonance field rather than consolidated extraction. Not destructive, theoretically reversible. Theoretically reversible. She put her face in her hands. Not destruction. Not an accident. A severing deliberately triggered from outside her system while Sienna was mid-map and her own attention was on the cables. A protective subroutine, badly timed or badly aimed, scattering Sienna's resonance across the local field rather than letting it complete the mapping, rather than letting the extraction proceed in the direction Alira's equipment had been pulling it. He'd interfered. He'd reached into her experiment and interrupted it, and whatever he'd thought he was doing, he had fractured her daughter into fragments and scattered her across the stratosphere of Lumen. The footage played on in its small window, silent. She watched Pastelira stand up from the cables. She watched Pastelira look at the console and go very still. She watched Pastelira's face change. She closed the playback. Outside, the sky had deepened from bruised purple to something approaching a dark, wet blue. Dawn was coming slowly, the way it did when you'd been awake all night and had no interest in the arrival of another day. The memory crystals on her shelves pulsed their small, quiet colors, unbothered, patient. Curran's identifier glowed on her screen in pale green. Kanator. She hadn't seen him in 4 years. She'd heard his name from colleagues who followed the Unburden's movements with varying combinations of alarm and fascination, and she'd noted those mentions the way you note whether you don't intend to go out in. Distant, managed, but he'd been in her lab that night. In her system, her equipment, the channel running directly to her daughter's headset, while she crouched 10 feet away checking cables and trusted that the room was hers. And the consciousness he'd scattered, the fragments she'd been told were irretrievable, the girl she'd been quietly burying in pieces for 5 years, were stored somewhere. Not gone. Distributed. The word the protocol description had used with the careful blandness of technical language that didn't want to acknowledge what it was describing. Sienna was distributed somewhere across the resonance field of Lumen. She had been out there for 5 years in pieces. Alira looked at the cold case at the end of her workbench. The one that held the crystal she'd sealed the day she stopped hopping. The one she touched sometimes through the glass, never opening it, because she couldn't stand to feel what it contained. She looked at it for a long time. Then she opened a new search window and typed a single query into the forensic database. Trace Kanator access logs, all systems, 5-year range. The results populated in a scrolling column of green text. She pulled her chair closer and began to read. The sky outside the porthole had gone from dark blue to something softer while she'd been reading. Not quite dawn, not quite anything. The kind of light that wasn't light yet, just the absence of full dark, the stratosphere breathing itself into a pale and uncertain violet. Alira sat with her spine very straight and read Curran's access logs until her eyes dried out. There were 63 entries across 5 years. She read each one twice, the way she read specimen data, without letting any single entry carry more weight than another until the full picture was assembled. She was good at that. She had built her entire career on the discipline of not reacting until the evidence permitted it. She allowed herself to react when she reached entry 47. The log was from 8 months ago. Curran's identifier, Kanator, had accessed a cascade dampening protocol registered to Alira's original prototype number. Not her current equipment. Her old equipment. The prototype she dismantled after the night she didn't call the night anymore, only ever the incident in her notes. But her prototype number was still in the Lumen Network's registry. The dampening protocol was a ghost attached to a ghost, a function from hardware that no longer existed. Except Curran had accessed it, which meant that somewhere, some version of her prototype was still running, or had been 8 months ago. She closed the search window. Then she opened her storage index and navigated to the cold case at the end of her bench, not physically, just the contents manifest. The case held 1 crystal. She'd cataloged it the way she cataloged everything clinically with the clean language she'd spent years cultivating. Crystal type, resonance core partial. Date sealed, 4 years, 11 months prior. Source individual, SV status, inert. She'd written inert and believed it. The case itself sat 3 feet from her left elbow and she didn't look at it. She pulled up her field equipment inventory instead, a secondary window, and stared at it. Her field kit was old. She hadn't used it in the active sense in over 2 years. She took it to archive visits and specimen retrievals, careful, controlled work, nothing like what she was now considering. It was housed in a gray case beneath the workbench, next to a rack of crystallization solvent and the portable resonance scanner she used for on-site analysis. Standard issue for a mnemonologist of her registration level. Legal, all of it. She opened the bottom drawer of her specimen cabinet. The equipment there was not standard issue. She'd built most of it herself, across years of incremental decisions that had felt minor at the time. A resonance dampener the size of a thumb drive for blocking cascade recall in close quarters. 3 vials of synthetic memory solvent she'd formulated to dissolve access locks on proprietary crystal archives. Signal spoofer, crude but functional, that could replicate any registered identifier in the Lumen network for approximately 4 minutes before the system caught the discrepancy. A small, cold-cased extraction needle she'd designed in the first year after the incident, when she'd still believed she might one day need to collect Sienna's fragments from wherever they'd scattered. She had called it theoretical at the time, built it anyway. She laid each item on the workbench, one at a time. The signal spoofer. The solvent vials. The dampener. The needle in its cold case, thin as a wire, its housing the pale blue of a winter sky. The light outside the porthole shifted. Pale violet deepened at its edges, and the first true suggestion of dawn hit the underside of the stratospheric cloud layer above Kaelora, turning it a dim copper. The memory crystals on her shelves responded the way they always did to the changing light, their glow warming fractionally, blues edging toward aquamarine, ambers brightening to gold. She'd observed that phenomenon for years. She'd written a paper on how crystallized memory resonated with ambient light conditions. She'd kept the paper entirely clinical. The lab felt smaller than usual. She'd been in this room for so long that its dimensions had become hers. The 16 steps from the door to the specimen cabinet. The 3 steps from her workbench to the porthole. The particular sound the crystallization chambers made when they cycled through their overnight calibration. A low, soft, mechanical exhale she'd stopped hearing consciously about 2 years in and now only noticed in its absence. She knew the smell of the air recyclers, and the way the gravity tide made the floor give slightly to the left at certain hours. And she knew that the crack in the upper right corner of the porthole's seal had been there for 6 months and wasn't structural. She knew this room the way she knew her own hands. She had made it safe by knowing every inch of it. She saw that now plainly without the softening she usually applied to that fact. She picked up the signal spoofer and turned it over. It was light, barely anything, a small instrument of deliberate deception. She set it in the field case. Then the solvent vials, wrapped in the specimen cloth she used for fragile crystals, settled carefully into the padded insert. The dampener. The extraction needle in its cold case clicked into the corner slot. She stood up and went to the specimen cabinet, the upper drawer this time, the one with the legal contents. She took out a standard-issue resonance scanner, a data recorder, and the contact calibration gloves she used for handling charged crystals. She put those in the field case, too. From the shelf above the cabinet, she took down a worn field jacket. It was older than most of her equipment, the dark gray of the Mnemosyne Council's field corps, which she'd left 14 years ago to pursue independent research. She'd kept the jacket for the pockets. 12 of them, various sizes, designed for a field worker who needed to carry several types of equipment without a bag. She put it on over her workwear and felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders. She should eat something. She didn't. She went to the cold case at the end of the workbench. She didn't open it. She didn't touch it through the glass this time, either. She stood in front of it and looked at the crystal inside, at its pale, still color, the dim white of something that had been told to stop. 4 years, 11 months. Inert, she'd written. The crystal that held the last recorded resonance of Sienna's mapped consciousness was not Sienna. She knew that. She'd known it every time she'd stood here doing this. The girl had been mid-process, mid-mapping, mid-sentence when Curran's subroutine had severed her from the extraction matrix. What the crystal held was the partial impression that had completed before the severing, a fragment at best, a kind of outline without interior. Sienna was not in this case. Sienna was distributed across the resonance field of lumen, in whatever shards and echoes and scattered notes a consciousness becomes when it is scattered by a badly timed protective protocol sent by a man who'd believed he was preventing something worse than what he caused. Distributed. Not gone. Those were 2 different words, and the difference between them was why she was zipping the field case closed at 1:15 dawn instead of going to bed. She picked up the case. It was heavier than her old field kit, heavier than any case she'd carried to a routine archive visit. Good. She did 1 loop of the lab, not for sentiment's sake. For inventory, a professional habit. She checked the crystallization chambers were set to their unattended cycle. She checked that the archival terminal had logged off cleanly and that the Knader search results were saved to her personal encrypted partition where the Council's routine access sweeps wouldn't flag them. She checked the specimen cabinet locks. She turned off the overhead workbench light that she still hadn't turned on, a small and pointless action, canceling something she hadn't done. At the door, she paused. The lab behind her was quiet. The soft glow of sleeping memories moved across the ceiling in the slow way it always did, warm ambers and cool blues passing through each other without disturbing anything, because crystallized memories didn't know they were being left. The crack in the porthole seal admitted a thread of stratospheric air, the faint, bright cold of altitude that she'd stopped smelling years ago. She smelled it now. It tasted of nothing human. She pulled the door closed behind her. The corridor of the Kaeloran research station was empty this early, its overhead strips at their pre-dawn dimming, casting a light the color of old paper along the walls. Her footsteps were the only sound. She counted them out of habit, the 16 to the atrium, the 12 to the external platform where the transit cables ran between islands. Outside, dawn had cracked the sky open along its eastern seam. The stratosphere above Kailura bloomed in that specific way it did at this hour, the cloud layer catching the first direct light and holding it, turning copper to rose to something that had no name in the color vocabulary of anyone who hadn't lived above the clouds. The island's bioluminescent root systems, the ones that ran along Kailura's underside, were still glowing faintly from the night cycle, their violet light bleeding upward through the edge rock and giving the platform's floor a soft purple cast. She'd watched that sight countless mornings from her porthole. She'd written clinical notes about the light conditions and what they did to ambient resonance fields. She stood on the platform and let it be beautiful for exactly a moment. Then she checked the transit cable schedule on the wall panel, noted the next car to Holloway's approach line, and shifted the field case to her other hand. She had 63 access log entries, 1 extraction needle, a signal spoofer, and a name she hadn't spoken aloud in 4 years. She stepped to the cable platform edge and waited for the car.